will start, and this webinar is recorded. So welcome, I'm Gail from The Shift, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all in this webinar. You know, we are living in some troubled world nowadays, and we need more and more a sustainable world. And to help us understand where we are now, where we stand, I'm very pleased to welcome Grayson and Leslie from SDSN. Hello, they are making every year a report to explain and to tell us where the world stands and where Belgium stands also regarding to the SDG agenda. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat. The chat is more to have small talks if you need so, or to share links. But the Q&A will be taken at the end for the discussion with our two speakers. So now I give the floor to Grayson.
Thank you so much, Gael. I will just actually go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see this okay. So yes, my name is Grayson Fuller. I'm a senior data analyst at the SDSN, where I work on the data and the statistics that informs our Sustainable Development Report, which is a yearly publication to track progress of all the member states on the SDGs. And I'm joined here today by my colleague, Leslie. Leslie, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to our colleagues?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to participate in this webinar. I am Leslie Bermont Diaz, Economist in the SDG Index team at SDSN, working with Grayson on the indicators to track progress on the SDGs and also on how to finance the SDGs across the world. Thank you. Go ahead, Grayson.
Excellent. And so the idea for today's presentation is that we'll give a quick overview of the Sustainable Development Report and some of the key findings in this year's edition. And then Leslie, my colleague, will go a bit more into details into some of the specific results and priorities for the country of Belgium. And so with that, let's get started. Now, I know The Shift is a member of SDSN, but I wanted to give a quick refresher to those of you who may not know about our organization. So we are essentially a network of thousands of knowledge institutions across the world. We were set up in 2012 with the UN mandate to help the implementation of the SDGs and the UN climate agenda. We have 3 pillars. So in addition to being a network, we also do kind of a think tank set of programs where we look into SDG policy analyses and data. And then we also have a pedagogical arm where we provide free online education on subjects pertaining to the SDGs, and that's called the SDG Academy. So for the Sustainable Development Report, we started this report in 2015, and the idea of it was to hold countries accountable for their commitments. We want to help support national debates on SDG prioritization. So how do you know which SDGs you need to invest more into, which ones you need to take more seriously given the timelines, and also to make the SDGs a bit more concrete. So to kind of make them a bit more granular and specific and a little bit less conceptual for policymakers. In addition to the work on kind of measuring SDG progress, we also want to help, let's say, bolster efforts to make SDG data available. So we work complementary to official monitoring efforts that can be done by national statistical offices, but also in regional levels, so for example, Eurostat, and then also the international levels, so the UN Statistical Division. We are kind of different from official organizations in that we have a bit more leeway in the data we use. So we don't always use administrative data. We can use kind of new forms of data, geospatial data, and help identify those places where administrative data can actually catch up with some of the innovations happening in unofficial data. So we have our international edition, the Global Report, which covers all UN member states. And this report is interesting because it basically allows for international comparisons across a very wide range of country settings. But we also publish editions at the regional level where we have a bit more specific indicators that are pertinent to that region. And then we also have some national editions which have even more specific indicators to kind of country level contexts, and that actually, let's say, disaggregate data at the subnational level. So, instead of just seeing how Belgium is doing as a country, with these kind of data, you can see how different regions or cities within Belgium are comparing with each other. And so all of these are available, by the way, on our website, sdgindex.com, freely available. In the past, in our presentations to the shift, we've gone a bit more into the details of the methodology. I think today we'll kind of skip over some of the extremely detailed sections of the methodology and just concentrate on some of the higher level aspects. And just a quick note to say that the methodology has been audited by the European Commission, by the Joint Research Center, and it has been peer-reviewed both by Cambridge University Press and by Nature Geoscience. So it's a well-established methodology. It doesn't change year on year, and it permits meaningful conclusions from the data. So about where our data comes from, so this is what I was hinting a bit earlier. So most of our data does indeed come from international organizations. So for example, the WHO, UNESCO, the World Bank. I would say about 2/3 of our data come from here, and we couldn't do the report without these data. So these data are extremely important for SDG monitoring. At the same time, we also use unofficial statistics that come from peer-reviewed publications and also NGOs like Birdwatch, Oxfam, or the Tax Justice Network, or Transparency International. And so these data are interesting because they help us fill gaps in official statistics, for example, in subjects that aren't covered yet in administrative data. So for example, issues related to spillovers or perception-based data that might not be available in official statistics. So given those data sources, how do we actually go about selecting indicators beyond using indicators that are the official SDG metrics? In the Global Report, we want to make sure that indicators are globally relevant so that they apply to a broad range of country settings. We make sure our indicators are timely, so they're useful for year-on-year monitoring. We have some kind of periodicity in the updates. We make sure that it's statistically valid, so basically they have a robust methodology that underline how they're measured, that they cover a wide range of countries, so we don't have too much issues with missing data, and that they have clear policy ramifications. So in other words, we can set a target that is applicable to all countries. So for example, we can't have targets on the percentage of population that works in agriculture, because we can't say what is ideal percentage of population that works in this sector. But for example, for indicators related to poverty, we can obviously say our goal is to have zero poverty across all countries. In terms of the number of indicators, we typically use about 100 indicators every year, plus or minus 10 or 15, and this is true for most of our reports. In the SDR, we have a set of global indicators that we complement also with a set of around 30 indicators specific to OECD countries. And we do this because OECD countries, they have better data availability, and also as kind of richer countries want to hold them to a bit higher standards. Also, another kind of unique aspect of our report is that we set absolute targets for all indicators. So this means that in addition to seeing where countries are, we can actually know, what does this mean relevance to where the country should be in 2030? Some reports, they actually don't establish targets for SDG monitoring. So a lot of national statistical offices, they might not have targets. Or Eurostat, for example, I would say for most of its indicators, it doesn't really set targets. And the useful thing about targets is that it lets us know, what does this performance mean relative to where it should be? And then also we can say over time, is this rate of progress sufficient or not to meet where the country needs to be in 2030? In terms of how we go about setting targets, we typically use SDG targets when they're available. We use the principle of leaving one behind when that's not possible. So for example, zero poverty, where everyone should have access to public services. In the case of SDGs 12 to 15, we may use science-based targets. And then lastly, An indicators where all of these things are possible, we simply set the target as the average of the best performance. And so in terms of what these results actually look like, we have these country profiles where we publish on the right-hand page these very detailed indicator level results. So for your country, you can see the actual indicator value, the year in which the data point was published, how it's doing in terms of the dashboard and the trends. You have very, very detailed data on one hand. But on the other hand, you have kind of more aggregate data, which is a bit easier to understand for people who are maybe not so familiar with the statistical system. And so you can get a quick overview of how the country is doing across SDGs and with respect to other countries. So here you see how France is doing on international spillovers, on the dashboard, and overall in terms of the SDG index. So I would say we have kind of three pillars in what we publish the results. We have our SDG index, which is, I would probably say, is what we're most famous for. It's kind of this ranking of countries using comparable data. But we also have dashboards which have the advantage of having a visual representation of how countries doing. So you can see the traffic light table, you can see quickly red, green, orange, yellow, how's the country doing, and then also the trends. So an assessment of if the progress is sufficient or not over time. Okay, and with that introduction, I'll get right into the results. So I would say we have 4 key results in this year's report, and I'll go a bit more into detail than some of the data-based ones. One is that we need peace, obviously, in order to meet SDGs. So anytime we have ongoing conflicts, we cannot really have SDG progress. It diverts attention, priorities, and investment away from the SDG agenda. Secondly, our data shows that for the second year in a row, the world has not been making SDG progress on average. This is mostly due to the pandemic, and that we really need to make sure that low-income countries have the financing they need to meet the SDGs. Thirdly, we show that rich countries are still generating negative international spillovers on other countries, which impedes their ability to meet the SDGs, notably through, for example, our consumption here in Europe or the United States, for example. And lastly, halfway into the SDGs, we show that policy efforts and commitments vary widely across countries. So some countries are doing a lot to meet SDGs, and other countries are engaging relatively little with SDGs. This right here is a chart that shows how the SDG index has been progressing over time. So we can see that from the years 2015 to 2019, there was steady progress being made on the SDGs. Now, obviously, this progress is largely insufficient to meet the SDGs by the 2030 deadline, largely insufficient, but there was progress. Whereas we see that in the last few years, largely due to the pandemic, we have not been making progress in the aggregates on average in the world. Our data shows this is largely driven by SDGs 1 and 8, so increased poverty levels and unemployment, less economic activity, and that most of these effects have been kind of concentrated in low-income and lower-middle-income countries. So here we see that from 2019 to 2020, both in low-income countries and in high-income countries, unemployment rates have risen. However, in high-income countries, these unemployment rates have actually started to drop already in the second year following the pandemic, whereas in low-income countries, this recovery has not yet happened. We think that these are due to, one, the fact that high-income countries have more fiscal capacity to spend on their population, so they generally have larger shares of government expenditure per capita. And then also it's easier for higher-income countries to indebt themselves, so they can borrow more easily in international bond markets. They have long maturities, lower interest rates compared to lower-income countries. This is another interesting chart in our report. It basically shows that from 2015 to 2019, there was some level of convergence happening between low-income countries and high-income countries. So low-income countries, obviously they're starting at the lower point, and so they were growing at faster rates in terms of SDG progress compared to higher-income countries. And yet, since the pandemic has happened, these rates of progress have actually either been negative or gone less than 0.1 points. And so this is extremely disconcerting because it shows that we're no longer seeing that kind of convergence in living standards across countries. In terms of the SDG index overall, our results are typically pretty stable year on year. So Nordic countries typically top the SDG index. This is because Nordic countries, in addition to high income countries in general, score better on these kind of socioeconomic dimensions of SDGs, which do comprise a large portion of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Nordic countries also typically do better on measures of inequality and some measures of climate compared to other high-income countries. And then on the other end, we see that our lowest performers tend to be countries that are either small and developing states or countries with ongoing conflicts. However, with that being said, no country is on track to meet all SDGs by 2030. So here you see the dashboards for high-income countries and low-income countries. And you see that while income countries do have better performance on SDGs 1 through 9, for example, they still have major issues on SDGs 12 through 15. So there's still major problems in our countries in terms of responsible consumption and production, action on the climate, and biodiversity. And in addition to these issues on the climate and consumption practices, we also generate huge spillovers on the rest of countries in the world. So here, for example, you see in this chart that typically the higher the region's SDG index score is, and this is also just country level, the higher the SDG index score, the lower the score is on our international spillover index. So for example, in the European Union, we have huge spillover effects, both through tax practices as well as consumption on the rest of the world. So for example, offshoring CO2 emissions in other countries. So to complement data that we have on outcomes in countries, we also want to have data on how countries are kind of onboarding the SDGs. We want to get a sense of the policy environment in the country because one, there's time lags in official statistics. So we can't always know how the current administration is doing on the SDGs because data may take a moment to actually catch up with the current level. And then we also can't necessarily attribute past SDG progress to the current government. So in order to get a sense of how the current government is taking on the SDGs, we have a yearly survey that we do on countries where we try to see how the country is integrating the SDGs into their official policy processes. So here you see we take measures of whether or not the country has done BNRs, do they have a national monitoring processes, how they integrated the SDGs into their budgets. And our results show that basically halfway into the SDGs, there are huge variations into how countries have been doing this. So some countries have been doing almost no efforts in terms of meeting the SDGs, whereas other countries are doing really, really great job in terms of integrating SDGs into official policymaking processes. In the case of Belgium, we do see that there's relatively good performance. So Belgium has submitted a VNR. There are actually sectoral action plans that integrate SDGs. So, for example, is there an education plan that takes into account SDGs, a health plan that takes into account SDGs? Is the national budget taking into account SDGs? In the case of Belgium, it's yes. There's a national monitoring system, and there is an SDG coordination mechanism in the actual head of government. So this is really great since you see Belgium scores relatively high here on our scorecard of government efforts, along with Nordic countries. And then on the other hand, we have the United States, which scores really poorly. It's actually the only country in our sample that has not submitted a VNR. And also interesting to note is that there are some countries where, even though they may be starting from a kind of lower SDG index score, they are taking the SDGs very seriously and integrating SDGs into official processes. And we hope that this means there will be huge SDG progresses in the years to come. So for example, you see here in the case of Benin and Nigeria, there is a lot of integration of SDGs into policies and government mechanisms, even though the countries are kind of starting from lower points in other countries in our sample. And so yes, that's it for my part of the presentation on the results of the SDG index and the Sustainable Development Report this year. I went a bit fast since we have a lot to get through, but don't hesitate to ask questions at the end of the presentation. And so with that, I will give the parole over to my colleague, Leslie. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grayson, for this great presentation. Let me share my screen. This one. Hope you can I hope that everyone can see it. Okay, great. So this is the end. So maybe at the beginning would be better. Yes. Okay. So thank you. So I'm following the presentation that Grayson just made about the SDR, and focus a bit more about Belgium and the overall results. So we're gonna just open the box of Belgium's results. Of course, I invite you to go check yourself on our website. I'm gonna put the link in the presentation at the end. So you can explore our results, Belgium's results, also compare the results of Belgium to the rest of the world if you wish. Um, okay, so let's dive into Belgium's specific challenges on the SDGs. So as Grayson just showed, Belgium ranks among the top 20 of countries in the world on our SDG index. So it's ranked 18 with a score of 79.7. So overall, it's a very good rank. Just after the Netherlands, I saw that there were questions about it. So Netherlands ranked 17, just before Belgium, and just after comes Japan. Okay, so that was the latest score of our latest edition of the SDG index. But now let's see a bit more how Belgium evolved in over the years. So first, you can see here on the graph that Belgium is represented by the orange line, and it shows the evolution of the SDG index from the early century, 20,000, until the last year available. We can see that since the adoption of the goals, so in 2015, the score of Belgium has risen significantly from 78.6 to 79.7 today, and that the evolution of the score in Belgium follows the average of the EU in yellow here of the European Union, although on the recent years it's a bit below the average of the European Union, but always above the average of the OECD in blue. And as Grayson mentioned, the last 2 years have been impacted mainly by COVID. And for the last 2 years, we can see that the score of Belgium is more or less stagnating, just as the rest of the world, mainly because of the pandemic. So the progress also were slowed down in Belgium. Okay, so this is the overall score. Now let's dive a bit into the main priorities of Belgium, or where Belgium has progressed on the SDGs, and which other goals still have major challenges to be tackled by Belgium. So here we're going to use the tool that we developed in the SDR, which is mainly the dashboards, which indicates with a pretty clear color codes the progress of and the states of achievement of each of the goals. So from goal 1 to 17, we have green, which means that the SDG is achieved. And then yellow, orange, and red, which means that major or significant challenges still remain in the country. So this is for the left panel here. We can see that while Belgium has achieved the goal number 1 on no poverty, in the other goals there are still challenges, significant challenges, or even major challenges that remain. So here clearly it's on SDG 12 for responsible consumption and production, SDG 13 on climate action, SDG 14 on life below water. And if we also combine these with the wheel, which is on the right axis that Grayson presented before, which appears on the country profile page, it gives the sub-index score by goal. So here you can see the score from 0 to 100 by goal for Belgium. And from that, we can also see that on SDG 15, life on land, and SDG 17, also SDG 2, but so life on land, SDG 17, partnerships for the goal, there are still challenges, and this could be also possible for Belgium to focus on those SDGs to improve progress. So all this, you can see it on our SDG index.org website. Here I put the link, and then when we share the presentation, you can directly have it and check also by yourself, explore. It's an interactive map, so you can click on each of the goal, and then you have by indicator of how the progress is shown. So that's what I'm going to show you now. We're going to open the box of each of those indices, sorry, SDG 12, 13, 14, 15, and 17, where we identified greater challenges for Belgium. So let's start, because these indices by goal, as Grayson mentioned, it's helpful to have an overview of the big challenges, helpful to give a direction in the policy or in private actions. But then when you want to take concrete actions, you need to know in which exactly dimension of this goal more effort is needed, because inside the goal you have many indicators and you have some where you already perform well, but others where you need more attention. So let's do this for SDG 12 on reduction. Here on the right, on the bottom of the slide is the list of the indicators that compose SDG 12 in our index. And you have the color code standing right after that, after each line of the indicator, saying red, the indicator is not achieved, the target of the indicator is not achieved, green is achieved. And then you also have yellow or orange. And on the right hand side, you have this little telling you more about the trends and the progress, if the country here, Belgium, is on good track, on a good progression to then achieve the target, or it's getting worse. So here we can mainly tell that the progress, there have been some progress in Belgium on production-based SO2 and nitrogen emissions. But there are still major challenges in those emissions, but measured as consumption-based, and also on waste, electronic waste, and exports of plastic waste. Then if we dive in the second SDG that were a major issue, SDG 13, on climate action, we can see that there are major challenges here as well that remain to decarbonize the countries and the energy system in Belgium, because both production-based and consumption-based CO2 emissions are still high, still above the targets that were set by the scientific community. And that overall the trend is not enough to foresee an improvement that will help Belgium achieve these targets if it continues with this trend. And even on CO2 emissions avoided in imports, which I'm going to dive a bit more later in the presentation, the trend is decreasing, so it's getting worse. On SDG 14 and 15 now, for life below water and life on land, there have been large progress on marine and freshwater protected areas that have been overall expanded across the country. The SDG, the target is achieved, for example, here already, here as well for freshwater sites. We can notice that for terrestrial sites, it's not the case. And we need improvements in Belgium on mainly fish discard, ocean water cleanness, and the biodiversity threats that are embodied in imports. So for generated by the consumptions in Belgium. And finally, I'm going to touch upon SDG 17 on the partnerships for the goals. We can see here, and it's a very good point, that there is a good performance of Belgium national statistical systems, which helps in making progress on the SDGs, because it gives us enough data, I mean, to measure and to know where are the main challenges, and so to select and target better our actions at all level of the society. So that's a good point. But then on other aspects of the goal, for example, the country needs to improve its contribution to official development assistance, ODA. Here we can see that it's contributing 0.5% of the GNI. The objective is to contribute 0.7%. Overall, there's only, I think, 5 OECD countries that achieved this goal. So Belgium is not the only country, but still we need more involvement in that. And then the country also needs to increase the involvement in illicit financial flows, unfair tax competition, and multinationals profit shifting, as we can see here on the dashboard for these indicators. Okay, now that we saw by topic the main priorities for Belgium, and again, I invite you to go deeper into that and check maybe each of the indicators, what they refer to, and we can also discuss that later. But I wanted to mention regarding the negative spillover they generate, because as Grayson mentioned, it's a very important topic right now to consider more the impact of each country has on other countries, and the way that the impact impacts the progress of on the SDGs of other countries. So Belgium is among the countries that generate the largest negative spillovers in the world, or like OECD member countries. Overall, here we have an index that's also it's a subset of the SDG index that focuses on all of these spillover indicators. So we can create a score also from 0 to 100, and 0 means that you don't have a good performance on that, and 100 means that you don't generate a lot of spillovers. So here you can see that OECD members, they generate more spillovers on average than other regions in the world. And that Belgium is slightly below this level, so it generates a bit more spillovers than OECD on average. If I want just to tell you a bit the ranking, Belgium is just above France and Germany, but it generates less spillovers than the Netherlands and Luxembourg, talking about the neighbors. So to give you a bit of context on the negative spillovers, in general, richer countries, as I said, OECD member countries, tend to generate more spillovers than the rest of the world, and they undermine the efforts of the other countries to achieve the SDGs. The European Union, for example, so it can be in terms of consumption of goods and services, that are, for example, in Europe, the consumption of goods and services is responsible for 16% of the world's deforestation. Also, for example, the demand of food in the EU contributes also to 16% of the emissions of particulate matters, PM 2.5 pollutions across the borders of the EU. So we have many dimensions in a spillover. It can be related to pollution, but also to modern slavery, child labor, etc. So the topic is that we are seeing a decoupling in the European Union between economic growth and domestic CO2 emission that comes from domestic production, but in terms of domestic consumption, so the demand for goods, services that we have inside Europe, for example, but that are produced elsewhere, these CO2 emissions are growing. Okay, So just to go a bit deeper in this spillover for Belgium, here it's the score for Belgians on all of the indicators that compose the spillover index. So we have different topics of spillover, as I just mentioned. There are the ones that are more about environmental, social impacts embodied into trades. And there are the ones that are more related to economy and financial flows or international security. Here we can see that mainly in Belgium, the spillover, the highest will come from all the environmental and social impacts embodied into trade. So from emissions, SO2, CO2 emissions that are embodied in imports, but also on the side of the exports of waste, plastic waste, electronic waste, etc. We have on the economic and financial flows side, the main one is the shifted profit of multinational that really affect the capacity of other countries to mobilize all the financing they need for the SDGs. But then on the more security side, Belgium here doesn't generate negative spillovers. Okay, I think for the details of that, I'm done. So now maybe I just wanted to quickly have an overview of what can be done, what can we do to progress more on the SDGs around the world, globally, and then we can also reflect on how to do in Belgium exactly for that. So these are just some suggestions. Of course, there are many things we can do. But the basic is that everyone can participate. All sectors of the society are needed to achieve the SDGs. So of course, the local and national governments that have to set targets, set regulations, also at the European level, it's very important, and provide some programs to include, as Grayson mentioned, the policy commitments survey. Then we also a large role of the academia that needs to push on the metrics and measurement of the SDGs, evaluation programs, etc. The civil society also, and of course there is a large role of the private sector. Um, the private sector plays really a key role because of many things, but among others, I just here selected 4 points. The first one is that we must leverage due diligence to address all the negative spillovers that I just mentioned before that are embodied in unsustainable supply chains. So the objective of due diligence is really to promote a reasonable care in the exercise and business. So act responsibly when you do business. It can be on the choice of the trade partner. You will not, for example, have a supplier that that does child labor or forced labor, model slavery, etc. It can be also more related to CO2 consumptions, etc. So the objective of the due diligence is really to hold business accountable for the impact they generate through their value chains. On that point, the EU is developing several regulations. So it's under process. It's still something relatively new. But for example, there is the zero tolerance on child labor. There is also the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which basically is made to risk of carbon leakage uh, by encouraging producers in non-European countries to green production processes. Okay, so, and then, for example, just an example, I think I'm going to be out of time soon, but in Sweden is the first country to have announced its intention to define a target to reduce consumption-based CO2 emission. So the objective of setting a target is that it can be binding also for the private sector in the way they do business. Okay, the second point where the private sector can have a large impact is on more the financial side and the role of international financial institutions and also multilateral development banks. They must revise their credit rating systems of low-income countries and the criteria they use to allocate conditional finance. They are the best source and the greatest source of increasing the financing for the SDGs. They can supply long-term, low interest rates to low-income countries. So it's capacity is expanded to more countries. Then there is also the large untapped potential of philanthropic giving. We measure it to 14 trillion US dollars, which can also be a great source of financing for the SDGs. And finally, why the private sector is really also key is that private companies can contribute to data collection on the SDGs by sharing their data on their supply chain, and because we need data systems, robust data system at all levels, at the national, local, but also at the industrial and corporation levels. So we need to have data on the impacts of each industry through the entire supply to inform better decisions on how to tackle those spillovers. So those consumption-based indicators, we need more data on this. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy our presentations. Thank you. Sorry. Here you have the link to our website, SDG Index. Also, if it's easy, code, and you can directly see our visualization tool webpage to go through the results of the SDR.
Thank you very much to both of you. And I will send to all the participants the recording and the presentations just in case you want to have the direct link and go deeper. There were quite some questions in the chat and in the Q&A, so we will try to tackle them in a short time we do have. I saw maybe an interesting one, SDG methodology, or so it's made for government at the origin of the exercise. So how could a company do to assess where they are, what is their performance regarding the SDG within their company?
Yes, that's a really good question. So for transferring this kind of SDG data to the company level, it's a bit of a difficult task. Obviously, not all of the SDGs are like at the company level, and then there's other issues at the company level that aren't necessarily relevant at the country level. I would say the biggest kind of obstacle right now is really just the availability of data. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting, let's say, dimensions of sustainability that have been identified by organizations where we need to kind of track on companies. So for example, as you mentioned, this can be the supply chains, so where they source their products from, their production practices, so how much waste they generate, their energy efficiency, is their energy renewable or not. It can be on taxation. So for example, is the company paying their fair share of taxes? I also have issues with this within the European Union with certain companies. And also the actual products, you know, is the actual products that the company is producing in line with sustainable development goals or not. So there's a lot of interesting things that can be measured, that need to be measured. In terms of having actual, let's say, comparable data across companies, this is where it gets really tricky. There's not like a standardized international reporting mechanism for this in the same way there is for SDG data. However, there are initiatives that are looking at this issue. So for example, I would encourage you all to go look at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And it's kind of a platform for companies that are dedicated to sustainability, and their kind of raison d'etre is actually just to look at kind of what metrics and indicators are available that can be measured at the company level. There is some data available for really, really huge companies. So for example, I don't know, these huge multinationals, but when it comes to, you know, a huge set of countries, then it becomes very, very difficult to get to these kind of disaggregated data for measuring sustainability. So yeah, it's a really good question. And it's definitely a work of progress happening right now. But for right now, I would say the main kind of issue is just the availability of data for SDGs at the company level.
Maybe when I will share the presentation, I will also share a link to the Action Manager tool. That is an assessment tool where you also can kind of map where a company is regarding the SDGs. Very quickly, because we have some questions. A list of the KPI per SDG. You can also find the list of every KPI for every sub goals of every SDG. So I will also put you a link in my email, because yes, this exists and it's very detailed. A good question regarding the spillover. Is there any sanction for the country who have bad score as Belgium, but also in general matter for SDG? Is there any sanction for low scoring countries?
Well, Leslie, do you want to take this one, or?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I would say, I mean, obviously in terms of our report, there is kind of sanctioning. So we do take into account these spillovers when we're calculating our overall SDG index score. So for example, countries that engage in profit shifting. So for example, if you have too favorable tax practices that makes companies want to declare their profits in your country, then these kinds of things are taken into account into our ratings, the SDGs and the scores. The quantity of CO2 emissions that you offshore, so for example, how much CO2 emissions you import, these kinds of things are also taken into account of. So in terms of the data in our report, this is kind of taken into account of when countries are sanctioned or, let's say, disadvantaged because of it. At the governmental level, so this is where things get interesting. I mean, as Leslie was mentioning, the country of Sweden has actually declared a target. And so there are some kind of national level initiatives where countries are trying to take into account this issue of spillovers into how they regulate their own companies. At the international level or regional level, so, I mean, for the moment, obviously, there's the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as Leslie mentioned. So importers do have to pay additional taxes when they import goods that kind of have a high carbon price embodied in the good. But I mean, I'm not aware of any kind of, also just because these kind of spillover metrics are not really included into official statistics yet, it's hard to have sanctions on them. So for example, Eurostat doesn't really have data on, you know, international spillovers really at the country level. But we obviously hope that things are moving in this direction, and that, you know, there will be more kind of action taken by governmental instances on making sure member states are complying with not just meeting the climate agreement objectives domestically, but also internationally. So yes, our fingers are crossed. That would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time. Yes, another interesting question is there any how that the consumer could help reaching the SDGs, picking products or services that would be favorable regarding the SDGs? So it means any certification or any label that could guide the consumer to those more favorable products?
Yes, I mean, this is a very good question. So I mean, right now, obviously, we collect our data at the country level. So I mean, the idea is that it's kind of indicative of, you know, the situation in the country or what the government is doing. But obviously, I mean, at the consumer level, these kind of impacts do reflect on the country and the aggregate. So for example, we do have some measures of the sustainability of diets. And so countries that typically have more vegetarian diets do better on these sort of measures, and countries that have a high proportion of meat consumption, because obviously, the greater proportion of meat in the country's diet in the aggregate, it means more CO2 emissions, the more water scarcity embodied in imports, nitrogen runoff from agriculture, eutrophication. It has a broad range of impacts. And so consumer choices do matter, and they do have impacts. Not necessarily for majority of indicators, but yes, for some indicators, we are able to capture these kind of impacts. So yeah, we don't have kind of like a program of work on like identifying by SDG what a consumer can do, but definitely it's important, and we encourage individual action as well as country level action. So yes, very important.
It's good
Yes,
to
sorry. Just yeah, I totally agree with Grayson, and I think, I mean, when we can, we have a huge responsibility to take on that, and we can contribute to a more circular economy. Be careful of buying, if, for example, also for food, try to buy from local producers that are like small in size when possible. But those kind of things, I think it's really adds up in the end. And so without talking about a specific eco label or anything like this, maybe just try to buy food from local producers. Also, try to reduce consumption in general. I mean, reduce our material footprint at our own individual level will help reduce the EU material footprint in the end. So also reduce the buying of clothes, also see where clothes were produced. So that's more talking about the spillovers on forced labor, these kind of things. I know that in a few days there's going to be a discussion in the EU about the Uyghur forced labor. So these kind of things, I think we can little by little be more aware of that and try to be careful about it. Sorry.
Thanks. I have a question myself. Last year, you made a presentation, and we were very proud to hear that we were fifth in the world regarding SDG ranking. I'm not talking about the spillover, that was a disaster. How come that this year we are 18? Are they the other even better than us locally, or?
Yeah, sorry, Gail, that's actually a really good point. I didn't dive into kind of the drivers of the change in rank for Belgium. I mean, what's important to note is that kind of the rank changes can be very delicate due to small changes in the overall score. So, I mean, Belgium scored relatively stable year on year, so I wouldn't overinterpret a kind of drop from the rank of 5 to 18 because it probably corresponds to a relatively small change in the actual score. And so this can be motivated both by other countries doing better and as well as by Belgium doing worse. So I didn't look into this question. I would need a little bit of time to actually dig into the data and tell you exactly why. So I can do that actually in the follow-up to this meeting. But my bottom line would be to not overinterpret the kind of change in the ranking at this kind of very high level of the top 20 performers.
Thank you. There's a very much detailed question that maybe I can put you in contact with William so you can answer this one, but I thought it was interesting. The question, you had a graph starting in 2000, but the SDG were developed in 2015. So how come you have data?
Yes, I mean, the data for the SDG index, we use indicators that have been collected, not necessarily since the start of the SDGs. A lot of these indicators that we now use to measure SDGs have been collected long before the adoption of the goals. So, for example, measures of poverty, measures of education access. I mean, a lot of these things have actually been collecting, I mean, since the Millennium Development Goals. So we have data on these issues a lot of times way before 2015. And so what we do is we use all the data we can to make the best time series as possible. For some indicators, it's not possible just because they might be new or because they're not periodically updated. But for a lot of indicators, we're able to make very good time series. So you can see, over the course of the last 2 decades, how a country has been progressing or reversing on that indicator dimension since we have data collection for it.
Great, thank you. Thank you both of you. Time is up. So I will send everything. If you have any other question that you would like to raise, don't hesitate. I will be the link between you and SDSN. And yeah, I will see you surely next year, and with better news, I hope, and in more short term to our SDG forum, hopefully in October. So thanks a lot, and bye to everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Gail, for giving this opportunity to present. We thank you a lot. And thanks a lot to the members of the Shift for attending this presentation. Very happy with this.
Yeah, thank you very much for receiving us, for organizing this webinar, and to all the participants for their questions and their attention. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.